It's amazing to see so many people coming in. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all very, very much for joining us here for this exciting event. My name is Rebecca Sweetman, and I am the director of the British School at Athens. Now, before I introduce tonight's chair and panelists, I wanted to share with you a little of who we are at the BSA. The British School at Athens is a research and teaching institution with a base in Athens and also in Knossos in Crete. Our remit is to support and promote the study of Greece and all things Greek in all periods. The great joy of this is that it makes my job brilliantly varied. And you can see on our website a list of events, the scope of what we cover, from things like Bronze Age burials and mountain shrines to George Finlay and Philhellenism. We cover philosophy to archaeological science too. And you're all very, very welcome to join our weekly Upper House seminars. You can join online, or if you happen to be in Athens, in person. And there are also many, many ways to get involved with the BSA. And I suspect that Katrina will share the link to the BSA website in the chat as well at some point over the evening. There are many events throughout the year, and the BSA supports scholarship through teaching at all levels and knowledge exchange, outreach, and research through the provision of the amazing research library, the archives that we have here, the Knossos Research Centre, and the Fitch Laboratory. And actually, the Fitch Laboratory is turning 50 next year, so keep an eye out for all the events that are going to be happening around that 50-year anniversary. Highlights over the year have been some of the work with the Young Archaeology Club. I've actually given up trying to make my own children be archaeologists, so I've moved on to fresh pastures, and we've been enticing children in here to try and encourage archaeology there. And we've also been collaborating with the British Embassy here in Athens on a writing festival. The theme of our next festival, which brings contemporary writers and scholars of ancient writing together, the theme for the next one is Explorers and Agitators. And that leads me to tonight. An explorer and agitator in her own right, I'm joined tonight by our guest chair, Professor Edith Hall, a renowned academic, writer, and presenter who has gone above and beyond to help promote classics and classical studies. She founded and directed the Centre for the Reception of Greece and Rome until 2011 at Royal Holloway, and with a focus on ancient Greek theatre and literature, as well as cultural history, she has blazed a trail in making classics accessible and appealing to broader audiences than ever before. So no better person than Edith in that case to chair our virtual roundtable with authors Claire Heywood, herself a classical studies graduate and author of Daughters of Sparta, Jennifer Saint, also a classical studies graduate whose latest book, Atalanta, follows her #1 Sunday Times bestseller, Electra, and Susan Stokes-Chapman, an English lit and education graduate whose debut novel, Pandora, has been translated into 16 languages. And actually, you can see them on the shelf behind her. She also is a #1 Sunday Times bestseller with Pandora as well. Now, Edith will introduce the panel, but before I hand over to her, I need to say just a quick few words about the practicalities of the event. Our chair and panelists welcome questions from you, the audience, and to ask a question, simply write it in the Q&A box at the bottom. So if it's in the Q&A box, it means we can all see it, and I'll read those questions out, or as many as we can cover. And without further ado, I'd like to say a final huge thanks to Edith and the panelists for giving us their time, their musings, and making themselves available to our audience for question and answers. So Edith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to be here with you, however much I'd actually like to be in Athens. It suddenly got very cold. So the big question we're all leading up to tonight is the why question. Why in the 2,750 years since the Iliad and the Odyssey and Hesiod started circulating in something like the form that we've got them, have so many wonderful new retellings in fictional form emerged really over the last 15 years. So that's going to be our sort of penultimate question. and we hope through the case studies of these wonderful individual writers to get somewhere towards that question. We'll be hearing a little bit of readings from each of them before that, though. But I should say that it's very easy by saying, good heavens, look what's been published since about 2010-11, to ignore the fact there were some very brave and fascinating pioneers who are always worth revisiting. One of my favorites and one of the very earliest sort of feminist retellings is Inga Merkel's fabulous 1989 An Ordinary Marriage, which is one of the funniest as well as the darkest readings of Penelope's, of the Odyssey from Penelope's point of view. We can't ignore Christa Wolf, who could, with both Cassandra in 1983 and her very experimental, multivocal, polyphonic Medea Stimmen, Medea Voices, 1996. And that was actually very dark and autobiographical about persecution by the publicity machine of the East German Communist Party, but it was still showed how to do new things with ancient Greek myths. I'm very fond of Ursula Le Guin's Lavinia. We're not talking much about Roman literature tonight, but that is one of the standout retellings of a deeply patriarchal text with an unusually silenced heroine. And let's just call it out for the men. I'm going to pick out two absolutely superb retellings. One's just a little bit before this, but it's one of my very favourites, and that's the late lamented Barry Unsworth's deeply feminist Songs of the Kings, which is basically a Fitzgerald and Aulis, but it's also multivocal and not just feminist, but deeply interested in looking at ancient Greek myths from an underclass perspective. And House of Names by Colm Tovine, how to do the Orostar in Ireland like no one else. And from a gay young man's point of view, let's make Orestes properly suffer. But of course, it is really the women authors in the last decade or so that's seen the greatest efflorescence, with stellar names like Madeline Miller, Pat Barker, Natalie Haynes, making huge international waves with Greek literature and mythology, and getting Homer winning literary prizes of the highest order. Homer keeps getting to be top prize, just as he was in the contest of Homer and Hesiod all those millennia ago. But it's our task today to ask the reasons why, and right at the end, maybe where it's all going. So who better to get on this team than three of the most distinguished British female authors who've produced bestsellers re-envisioning the experience of ancient mythical women. Claire Heywood is a classicist, an academic classicist. She's won prizes in classical subjects at Warwick and really knows her stuff. Has written two novels, Daughters of Sparta, which is the Trojan War retold from the perspectives of those sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra, and The Shadow of Perseus, which extends it to three female perspectives, Medusa, Danae, and of course Andromeda. Susan Stokes-Chapman is, I think, I don't know, we're going to talk about these, I think she's a thriller writer. If I had to say what is Pandora, I would probably say it's a thriller. I love this because we get a Georgian setting of late 18th century antiquarianism. I also happen to be very fond of Lichfield, where it was really at in the 18th century, which is where she's from. This is where Samuel Johnson wrote most of that dictionary, I think. And her novel is set actually on the cusp of the new century in 1799. It's not set in antiquity, and it's going to be very interesting to talk to her about why she decided to weave in this archetypal myth of Pandora and Hephaestus. Jennifer Saint really has knocked the socks off everyone in with a kind of crescendos from Ariadne, Electra, and now Atalanta. And the animal sex scenes in Atalanta really knocked my socks off. We had quite a long discussion about that a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed her at the Durham Literary Festival. So enough from me. I'm going to jump straight in and ask you in turn. And let's do it, Claire, and then Susan, and then Jennifer. What got you into it in the first place? I know you did classics, Claire, but, you know, something must have made you do classics. What's your
Yeah,
story? What's your story?
it's not a fully sensible story.
Good.
I come from a state school background, never formally studied classics at school. There was no provision for that. But I loved English. I loved stories, myths, legends, fairy tales, anything I could get my hands on in a less formal way. And then when I was looking at courses for university, I started sort of Googling a little bit away from English, and sort of looking at Egyptology or ancient history or something like that, because I liked watching documentaries and films on those kind of subjects. And I discovered this thing called classics, which I'd never even been able to put a name to before. I never heard the term classics until I was 18. And then I applied, and it just felt like this leap of faith, really, that I somehow knew that I would find this really interesting, based on my interest in English and literature, but also languages. I'd studied French, and I could tell that I would love to learn Latin and Greek. So it was a kind of mingling of different interests in one type of degree.
When did the creative impulse hit you, though? When did you want to stop reading and start writing?
Oh, that long predated my interest in classics.
Right.
We're talking primary school. As I say, I had this fascination with stories. I loved reading. And yeah, from primary school age, I was trying to write my own stories, and read them out to the class. And, and I got that sort of positive feedback of people enjoying the stories that I'd made up. But it was also...
Did you have an epiphany moment? I mean, for me, it was... the great special effects Jason and the Argonauts movie. I mean, definitely. I was only about 4, that.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen, with those Harryhausen gods pushing ships through rocks and things. Was there a standout for you?
Well, I mean, I think that's genuinely one of my influences too, in terms of early kind of pushing in this direction. My dad was a big fan of those films,
Right.
Clash of the Titans, Jason and the Argonauts. So I ended up watching those with him when I was quite young. And I agree, they are really absorbing, even though it's all kind of practical effects. They draw you into that mythical world, and they're certainly memorable. So that probably is one of the first kind of popular media exposures that I got to classics.
What about you, Susan? What's your story?
See, mine's a bit of a messy answer. I will, like Claire, I think my interest in writing pretty much stemmed from primary school. It really kind of heightened when I was a teenager. So I'd say 13, 14, that was when I started reading a lot of historical novels. I have to backtrack ever so slightly here and just say that my interest with the Georgian, I mean, being from Lichfield, I think that was always going to be around me. There was a very subconscious sort of influence that was happening there. But my love for the Georgians actually came about from watching the 1995 BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice.
Oh.
Just kind of went from there. And I won't kind of wax lyrical about that, but I think essentially this sort of interest developed from that point on. I am not a classicist, I've already said this, and I would say that, Pandora, the novel, is a loose reinterpretation of the myth rather than a retelling. I think for me, classics have always been on the periphery of things, because obviously the classics, Greek myth, Roman history, it's influenced so much of a lot of literature we have grown up with, Shakespeare being one of them, and I could just list them all. I'm not going to, it's just going to take too long, and
I think you're underestimating it. I mean, I think the curious woman
well,
who creates fascination for herself and mayhem for all the men around her, be more Hesiodic.
No, I mean, but in terms of my kind of inspirations, I don't think the classics were specifically there right from the start, but they've always been something I've been aware of. At university, I did education in English literature at university, and one of the English literature modules was classics,
right.
Greek and Roman epic drama, I believe the course module was called. And I was interested to see there that a lot of the stories revolving around these were very much the woman was never centerfold. Women were always treated. Well, let's be brutally honest here. A lot of these stories are very misogynistic, and women are very much written as victims or villains. So I was aware of that, certainly. But it wasn't until 2017, after being rejected for another novel that I've since shelved, that I just had this light bulb moment of both Dora and Hermes the Magpie just popping into my head fully formed.
Wow.
And off the back of that, the Pandora myth just kind of scooting in underneath. And it's just a myth I've always been aware of. And I think we all have, you know, the general premise is woman Pandora given a box, told not to open it, opens it anyway, and all loads of rubbish comes out, all bad things, slamming the lid shut and hope remains. We all know that as a general kind of, you know, premise. So I think a lot of my ideas have been influenced subconsciously and, you know, just in various different ways, rather than me actively thinking I'm going to write a book about Greek myth. That wasn't the set out. It's just I had Dora in my head, as I said, and I just thought, how can I play about with weaving that myth in? But I think that's probably another question for later.
Okay, Jennifer, how about you? Your story's a little bit like Claire's, isn't it?
Yeah, well, so certainly what you said, Claire, about always being interested in writing, that rings true. And you triggered this memory for me of in primary school. I've just remembered I wrote a book that was a retelling of Sleeping Beauty from the perspective of the Wicked Witch. So I've been doing this a long time. I made it into a book. I drew the book cover. I read it to my classmates. The feedback I got was it was very long. So, I mean, but still I kept going. They're like early critics, never mind. And I really, really loved Greek mythology, just always. I was interviewed by Edith recently, and I was talking about going to Cyprus when I was young with my family, these family holidays we took, and just this sense that I had reading the stories, being in the place where they were set. I think Greek mythology is so very rooted in the physical world, in the landscape around it. And the fact that you can kind of walk among ruins, or you can sit in an ancient theatre, or you can see the mosaics of these mythical scenes that then you can read about as well. There was something really magical in that for me, because I think the stories just felt so real. And as a kid, I just wanted to lose myself in stories all the time. And Greek mythology is such an escapist genre. It's such a kind of fantastical, magical place to disappear into. So I always loved those two things. It took me an incredibly long time to put them together, because I didn't start writing Greek mythology until I was about 35. So I was writing other things and reading about Greek myth. But like you, Claire, I went to a state school. There was no suggestion that you would study this stuff. You know, I was reading it in my spare time. But I didn't realize that people could actually, that it was an academic rigorous discipline as well as just being something that I enjoyed. So it was when I was in sixth form, actually, that I discovered that a college nearby, a college in Leeds where I'm from, offered classical civilization A-level. And I thought, I could be doing that instead of what I'm doing now. So I dropped out of sixth form. I got a job until the end of the year. I re-enrolled. And I started studying classics age 17, and then never really looked back. I thought, you know, once I'd done that for A-level, I was very committed. So I went on to read it for my degree at King's College in London. And then, although I became an English teacher because classics teaching vacancies were few and far between, I was always, as kind of Susan was talking about, sneaking classics onto the curriculum, because it's very easy to do when you're an English teacher, because it is everywhere.
Hooray! Fantastic. What commitment. I actually think it's 25 parts. I think the best step now is to, you know, jump straight in with both feet and hear a little bit of each of the three of you. It'd have to be very short doing three of you in 50 minutes. But could we do that? Would you be prepared to go first, Claire, and just to tell us why you've chosen that particular excerpt?
Yes. I've just chosen a few pages from my second novel, The Shadow of Perseus. As Edith said, it's the story of Perseus, but told from the perspectives of three women in his life: Danae, Medusa, and Andromeda. So this is partway through the book, where Medusa actually meets Perseus. My Medusa is a little bit different. She's living remotely in ancient Libya, and she's just gone to set some snares in the forest. The sun had crossed the sky and was beginning to dip as she knelt down to replace the final snare. Even with her fingers busy, she always kept her ears sharp, and so when the twig snapped, she heard it. Her bow was drawn before she had risen to her feet. She turned in silence, watching for movement, a flash of fur. She expected a gazelle, feared a wolf, but what she found was altogether more surprising. There between the trees, barely a stone's throw from where she stood, was a young man. Though she ought to have feared this sight more than any wolf, she found her bow lowering in bafflement. The boy, for he was barely a man, was stepping backwards, feeling out the ground with his feet, while his eyes were fixed on a small bronze shield he held in front of him. She watched him with curiosity, but could make no sense of his behaviour. Was he mad, perhaps, too long exposed in the midday sun? He did not have the look of a Libyan. By his clothes and complexion, she would guess he came from the islands of the Great Green, and she had heard that the sun shone less fiercely there. Eventually, her curiosity overcame her wariness, and she stepped towards him. "What are you doing?" His feet froze, but he did not turn his head. "Who's there?" She had guessed right, for he spoke the Greek tongue. It had been some years since Medusa had spoken it, but she was pleased to find that her mouth remembered. "Why do you hold your shield so?" she asked, ignoring his question. She moved closer, her bow forgotten at her side. She saw his eyes flicker a little, but he did not turn his head. "There is a terrible creature that haunts this forest, with great wings and snarling tusks and shining hands of bronze. Its gaze is deadly to all who look upon it." "Is that so?" Medusa was quite amused now, but tried to keep the laughter from her voice. "If I look at the beast only through the reflection of my shield, it cannot harm me." He spoke with conviction, and yet she could see his arms tremble a little. She stepped toward him again. "And must you avoid my gaze also?" He paused, and his chin twitched. I suppose not." He lowered his shield and finally turned toward her. His face was youthful, unbearded, but his shoulders were muscular despite the slightness of his frame. "What's your name?" she asked. "Perseus. And yours?" "Medusa." He stood regarding her for a moment, curious green eyes moving over her face, her clothes, her bow, and back to her cropped hair. Medusa doubted he had ever seen a woman such as her. "You should not be in the woods alone," he said. "Does your husband not fear for you?" "I have no husband." "Your father, then?" "I have none." To her surprise, he nodded, as if with sympathy. "Still, it is dangerous. There are snakes and wolves, and not to mention the beast." His body took on a renewed tension as he said it, and she could see he was trying to resist glancing through the trees. "What is the name of this beast? I have lived in this wood for many years and have seen no such creature." His brow creased. "Why, you must have heard of it. It is notorious in this land." Perseus dropped his voice to a whisper. "The fearsome Gorgon." This time Medusa could not hide her amusement. "Why do you laugh?" asked Perseus, his expression earnest. "It is a terrible foe. It has claimed the lives of many men hereabouts. Its gaze turns their very blood to stone." His eyes were wide, his fingers gripping the edge of his polished shield. "Tell me then," she said, leaning towards him a little and speaking softly. "How is it that any man knows what the creature looks like?"
Thrilling, very physical encounter. Supernatural as well, tingly, very brave.
Thank you.
Susan, take us from the deep dark wood in the Bronze Age to a cellar, I think.
I'll take you to a deep dark basement.
Yes.
In Georgian London.
Yes.
So, as I mentioned earlier, Pandora is more a loose reinterpretation of the Greek myth, Pandora's box. I can go into my reasons why I chose to do that later. But obviously, one thing we do know for sure is that Pandora is a very curious woman in mythology, and my Dora is also very curious. So a mysterious shipment has been delivered to the antiquity shop where she lives. Her uncle is being very dodgy about it and won't reveal what it is, and she can't understand why. So she's decided to break into the basement, and this is going from there. So Dora wastes no time. Careful though she is, her impatience has tipped itself over, and it is not in her now to be slow. Down the narrow stairwell she goes, stealing over the weak treads. At the bottom, she uses the door open as she did before, props it open this time with a grotesque iron fish Hezekiah picked up from a vendor on the Strand, and it is only when she is standing in front of the double doors of the basement that Dora realises she is shivering. She places her sketchbook and candle on the floor. Well then, Dora murmurs to Hermes, shall we see if this works? Very carefully, she reaches for the padlock, cradles it in her hand. It is cool to the touch, and with her bottom lip pressed between her teeth, she slips the key into the lock. Please, she thinks, please let it fit, and she almost cries when the key turns easily without a sound. The padlock gives a low click, the chain shucking through the handles as it begins to fall loose. Dora wraps her hand around it, guides its fall quietly to the floor, puts the padlock down beside it. Hermes tugs at a strand of her hair. For a long moment, Dora stands immobile. Now that it has come to it, now that nothing bars her way, she feels unaccountably frightened at what she might find, and yet the urge to fling open the basement doors is as instinctive as breathing. Very carefully, she pulls them open. They do not creak. Dora releases the breath she's been holding in a long, quiet spell. Retrieving the candle and sketchbook from the floor, she crosses open onto the top stair. She cannot see a thing. It is as if before her there is a vat of ink, fathomless, darker than dark. Instantly the hairs raise on the back of her neck, and she feels a whisper of cold air at her cheek like a sigh. On her shoulder, Hermes' talons press sharply through her dress into her skin. Dora winces at the pinch. Hermes, stop, she whispers, and to her surprise, the bird hisses in response. Hermes, what? Suddenly the bird launches himself into the basement, and the sound of his wings makes Dora jump. Instinctively, she cups the candle, shields the flame from his beating feathers. Hermes, she calls, quiet a hiss of her own. Where are you? But there is no caw in answer, no chirrup. There is instead an odd, low hum. Dora hovers at the top of the stairs, blinking blindly into the dark. Hermes! Still, there is nothing bird-like in any case, and with a sigh, Dora holds the candlestick out in front of her, very slowly lowers her foot onto the stair below. It creaks beneath her toes. As she descends, her eyes begin to adjust, and she sees with relief the bony fingers of a candelabrum sitting atop a small crate at the bottom of the steps. Dora rests her sketchbook on the crate, lights up the tall pillar candles from the stub of her own. The room brightens a moment, the light flickering in on itself before settling into mellow ochre. As her eyes accustom, Dora stares, open-mouthed. The basement is larger than she expected it to be. Deep bookcases line one wall, filled with item after item that in the murk she cannot make out. More crates are stacked against the back wall, spilling straw. Behind her, beyond the wooden staircase, the basement goes further back, and Dora wonders what the darkness of it hides. In the corner stands Brammer's safe, its gold and black lock glinting in the low light. On the other wall hang some more shelves, each containing a large collection of tightly packed scrolls. A desk sits beneath, 4 large crate sides propped next to it. She squints, notes the verdigris, the mollusks clinging to the mottled wood. On the chair that sits tucked beneath the desk perches Hermes, restless, his eyes beads of jet. And there in the middle of the room is a vase, the likes of which she has never seen. The vase is tall and wide, extremely large, would reach her chest if she stood next to it. It is fluted in shape, a small base that expands in the middle, dipping once more at the neck. It has a domed lid with 2 handles fashioned into snakes. In the golden glow of the candles, the colour is earthen, and on the sides, even from a distance, Dora can see a network of images carved into it. Entranced, she takes a step forward, and the candle flames dip. Pandora! It is a whisper, a keening sigh. Hermes croaks, flaps his wings. Dora gasps, spinning around, afraid her uncle or Lottie might be standing at the top of the stairs, afraid she has been caught. But there is nothing. There is no one. The candles brighten. Very slowly, Dora turns back round, her gaze settling unnervingly on the vase. The air seems to crackle, a high thrum of energy that warms her ears, tickling her collarbone. Surely not, she thinks. She is tired, that is all. But Hermes heard it too. Dora swallows. It cannot be. Shaking herself, she crosses the basement floor. She stares down at the vase. Her grip on the candelabrum tightens, but beneath her unease she feels excitement, because carved into the lid are a set of distinctive Grecian figures. Almighty Zeus, the traitor Prometheus, crippled Hephaestus, beautiful Athena, and Dora smiles. She has found her inspiration. Dora reaches out her free hand. There is a sudden sigh, a hum, a fluttering. It comes not from behind, but in front of her, from within the vase, and Dora hears all at once its siren call, its darkling plea. It is the hush of wind, the whisper of waves, the music of grief, and she cannot help it. She cannot resist. Dora lifts the lid.
Amazing build up of suspense. just how long is it going to take? We'll just come back later to the sort of supernatural once we've heard Jennifer's excerpt. Again, could you just explain where this comes in the Atalanta story, please?
Yeah, I was just going to say that bit when I read it in Susan's book, when I got an early copy, just gave me chills, and you just reminded me of it. So yeah, so Atalanta, I'm going to read from the prologue, so there's no backstory that anybody needs to know. But Atalanta is a very unique heroine in Greek mythology. She is the only woman who boards the Argo, though you probably, if you don't know a lot, you know, so if you're not a big classics geek, you might not know, because she doesn't always get her credit in that story. But a woman as extraordinary as this has got to have a very extraordinary origin story, and that's the prologue, and just a section of it that I'm going to read. When I was born, they left me on a hillside. The king had given his decree: if it's a girl, expose her on the mountain. And so some unfortunate soul was dispatched from the palace with this unwanted scrap of humanity, a baby girl, instead of the glorious heir the king desired. Left on the earth, I suppose I might have howled for as long as my little lungs could bear it. Or I could have lain, whimpering and fearful, watching as she came closer. The mother bear, her cubs still blind and damp-furred, attracted by the plaintive sound of a desolate newborn, her maternal anxiety still at its peak. I'd like to think that I looked up at her, the mother bear, and held her gaze, that I didn't flinch away from her hot breath or the rough caress of her paw. She must have been too solicitous to leave me, unable to stand the sound of a hungry infant, and so she scooped me up and took me back with her. I grew strong on bear milk. I learned to wrestle with my bear siblings, the rough and tumble of our play with no quarter given. I never cried when their claws or teeth scraped my skin, or when they growled and pounced. Rather, I twisted my fingers into their fur, pulled them to the ground, buried my own teeth in their flanks, and bit as hard as I could. By night, we curled up together, a tangle of limbs, ursine and human, the soft pads of their paws resting on my sun-browned flesh, in our warm nest of leaves and earth, the damp rasp of their tongues against my face.
Wow. So we've had human, well, snaky lady on human, human lady with a sort of omniscient bird, and a little baby getting taken in by a bear. These are crossing ontological boundaries, all of them. It's quite fascinating. So I think it's time to hit the big questions. We want to allow plenty of time for people clocking in to people who've joined us virtually to get some questions in at about 10:02. So I think it's time for the big question. Now, I've got 4 very provisional ways of answering the question, why the last 13, 14 years there's been this glorious efflorescence, literary efflorescence that you're all part of. And I, as a classicist, am so incredibly pleased about, because it helps make our subject palatable. So obviously there's a sort of socio-political reason. It is something to do with feminism, clearly, and women are now reclaiming the classics, or claiming them in a way that they've never been able to before. Emily Wilson's Iliad, you know, everything. Aesthetically, I think something's very important aesthetically. All of you are very interested in what the ancient text can give us about voice and who gets to take the story. Where do we use third person narrative? Where do we use first person? So do you think that's a part of it, that people are trying to push, or with magical realism, people are fed up with the realist novel, right? Or do you think that it's maybe more philosophical, that this is actually about human anxiety, about the human race, what it is to be human, and disintegrating boundaries with gods and animals, and, you know, is our rational Western self dissolving? You know, anyway, please go for it. Who'd like to go first?
I mean, I think everything that you said, I was thinking, yes, it's that. So it's obviously, a whole convergence of all these factors together. And it's funny, just in your introduction, when you were talking about these other really kind of innovative, really influential novels that have been written, and you mentioned Christa Wolf, and you said that Cassandra was 1983 and that Medea was 1996. And I was thinking, I was born in 1983. I turned 13 in 1996.
Wow.
And being a teenage girl in the latter half of the 90s, feminism was like a dirty word. You could not call yourself a feminist, sorry. The Spice Girls were all about girl power, but they didn't use that word. And I think there is this idea that you couldn't complain about any aspect of how women are represented or treated. You just had to kind of keep up with the lads. That was very much the kind of tone. And so the idea that these stories, which I really loved, maybe were not always very fair in their portrayal of the female characters, I would honestly say didn't occur to me at the time, or it wouldn't have, I don't think it would have been particularly well received if I'd started talking about it. So for me, it was really, I felt that the Me Too movement was particularly influential in suddenly allowing all of these women to speak collectively at the same time about the kind of experience that they have. And when you then apply that to these stories that you've been reading your entire life, that you have loved and not questioned, and you kind of think, where's the Me Too movement here? When I'm reading these stories to my sons, who I want to teach to grow up and be, respectful of women and good men in the society that we live in. But I'm reading this story about this brave hero Theseus, who comes along and slays the Minotaur and abandons Ariadne, who gave him the clue to get out of the labyrinth, who gave him the weapon to defeat the Minotaur with. She just disappears out of that story and it just belongs to him. And I think for the first time, I started to get angry and I started to see that pattern among all of the myths, the way that I absolutely love Ovid's Metamorphoses, but it is a catalogue of assaults on women. And I think that great novels sometimes get written out of anger and rage, and that's what kind of propels you, gives you that creative force. And I felt that around that kind of sort of 2017, 2018,
wow.
There was
so you're tugging me back from all my philosophical and aesthetics things and just saying, excuse me, women still have a long way to go, and this is a jolly good and fun way of doing it, right?
It's a lot of fun, lot of fun. But
how about you, Claire? What do you think, if you had to do like the academic essay, what are the reasons for the efflorescence of women's retellings of classical mythology since 2009?
I mean, I often get asked this question, and I think when you're a classicist and you're more classically aware, you kind of know through time that classics has gone through peaks and troughs of popularity in terms of reception. There's been, hundreds of tragedies, operas, whatever you like, written on these characters, these stories. So it doesn't feel like an entirely new wave, just another part of this tide, going through history. But at the same time, it takes something to kind of instigate that. As Jennifer was saying, a kind of a Me Too moment, a kind of opening of the floodgates and people feeling confident to be able to talk about things in different ways because other people are, there's allowed. A collectivity to it where, one thing sets off a chain, and it turns out that all these people kind of had these feelings or these potential feelings all along. They just needed something to kind of unleash that. So maybe that's what's happened. And I think there's another aspect to it as well, with the kind of floodgate aspect, just in terms of the popularity of classics generally, not just in novels, but it's always been a more sort of elite subject, and there's been a certain amount of gatekeeping around it, I would say, and it's sort of this well, it's
underestimate of the century.
Yeah,
there might have been a certain amount of gatekeeping around the cultural property that is classics.
Exactly, and it felt like this kind of secret club, and especially coming from a not posh background, a state school background, going to university with all these people that have studied it since they were 7 or whatever. it felt like they'd all been in this club all their lives, and then suddenly I was allowed in, you know. And then you've got access to all this knowledge and all these stories that you've kind of known on the peripheries. Like Susan was saying, you know, she was aware of the myth of Pandora. There's lots of myths that we kind of gain by osmosis, but we haven't had that direct contact with the original texts necessarily. So I think this popularity in popular media, books, films, whatever it might be, is a gateway for more people to access.
You're really bringing in class pretty solidly alongside gender here, which is very, very interesting. Susan, as you answer, could you also tell us whether tell us the answer, can you sort of blend that in or use that as a prelude to whether you're going to be giving us another novel with classics in it?
So this is, I think Jenny and Claire have really pretty much hit the nail on the head there.
Right.
And there's not a massive amount I can offer to that, except to say that, I mean, there's actually a comment in the chat there. I mean, is there an intense desire for collective female awareness today to try and save women of the past that have been assaulted, reduced, ignored, betrayed? And I think that's also the answer. Yes, I think there is. In the case of Pandora and her being vilified for her curiosity, I found it very intriguing to try and give my Pandora some agency to show that her curiosity was not a sin, but a strength. And it's finding different ways of interpreting people's stories in history, whether it's ancient mythology or women, you know, generally of the past. So in terms of, you know, why are we doing this? I think, and it's not just the women either, I think it's the men as well, trying to get a different side of the story across, try to show the reader that there was another side to this person and it's worth exploring, and how can we explore everything that means. And I think there's just that thirst of trying to reinvent and reinterpret and rediscover characters of history by doing these retellings. And I think that's something very, very important. Because I'm not a classicist, I will admit that like the Pandora myth, for me, as I said, it kind of just followed on very neatly from my Dora and Hermes fully formed, you know, fledged idea. But beyond my knowledge of Greek mythology, because obviously having to research it for the purpose of this story, as a non-classicist, I won't be continuing across that vein. However, I think stories in history and elements of myth and magic have always had a kind of pull for me. I think in terms of where we are potentially going, I might kind of end up answering a question that's for later, but it does kind of also pertain to my answer here as well. My second novel is The Shadow Key. It's coming out in April next year, and it draws heavily on Welsh myth and legend. It is not to the level of the way I've used the Greek myth Pandora, but I've definitely kind of drawn into that. Anything I write will always be in the Georgian period, because it is my kind of happy place. But I find history in terms of what was happening in that era as well, which is a very progressive era, and also in some ways very limiting as well. I've taken some elements of the Hellfire clubs of the period and their feelings on faith and demonology and all that kind of thing, and it draws, and it kind of is a juxtaposition between the Welsh myth. I'm trying not to give away too much, but the point is there's that element of the unknown and the supernatural I find very, very intriguing. And I think that is potentially the way that things are going to be going later on. And it's already made a start. So Lilith by Nikki Marmory, that's a new one. So Lilith being the first woman rather than Eve. So that's a really good book in terms of, again, exploring another side of the story that we already know. But Celtic and British folklore, I think, is going to start really kind of coming out the cracks now. I mean, Sophie Keach has recently written something called Morgan Is My Name, so that draws heavily on the Arthurian legends. Lucy Holland wrote Song of the Huntress, and that's going to be coming out soon, and that's drawing on British folklore. And Elodie Harper is also going into ancient Britain with Boudicca's Daughter, which is going to be due in May 2025.
Oh, great. That's
so
fantastic.
there's a lot of these stories
Yeah.
of ancient history, and even some of our recent past, that I think people are really going to start kind of leaning towards now.
That's a really interesting answer, which opens out, you know, where classics meets other kinds of things. Claire and Jennifer, could you each give me literally 30 seconds? We must hand over to questions. What is the book you're working on now?
Well, I just got my editorial letter back on it today. And my next novel will be moving away from mortal women and into the realm of the Olympian gods. So the next subject that I'm writing about is Hera, the queen of the goddesses and the wife of Zeus.
Amazing, because she's really the least pleasant character of them all. So good for you. How about you, Claire?
This is a bit of an exclusive because I haven't found the time to sort of announce yet. But
we're honoured. Are you sure? Are you sure you
no,
want?
I'm happy to. This is forced me to actually say something.
British School of Athens gets the scoop.
Exactly, just for you. My work in progress is a retelling of Dido, based on the Aeneid and also other sources, and kind of a pseudo-historical, legendary retelling of her life. So
wonderful. I'm involved with a new play about that's by Magdalena Zero, a Cypriot theatre director, who's also using other sources. We could talk about that. I think we're done on the general panelist interview. Can I thank you, ladies, so much? I mean, it was such a tight brief to cover all three of you in that time. I think you've said some really interesting things, especially about the why question and the future. So thank you very much. Rebecca, do you want to hand over to chair the questions from the general public?
Thank you very much. I'm completely wanting more and more and more. So I'm not sure we'll ever let you go, you guys, but thank you all very much. And thanks to Edith for her wonderful chairing. Can I start the Q&A session, first of all, by asking people if they've got questions, that they should type them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, because they get lost otherwise in the chat box. But I'd like to start with a comment from someone here, Dimitra. I can't read her surname, and she says, as a Greek Anglo-American woman, I took for granted my ancestral myths and the dominant male protagonists. Thanks to all of you and the other brilliant author of Retold Myths mentioned tonight, I can never read the Iliad again without thinking of Briseis. Thank you for putting women into the picture and more. So I think that really is a wonderful summary of what you guys have been doing through your work. So thank you. Quite a number of people have asked about your process, your writing process, your research process, whether you kind of read analytical papers regarding the myths, what is both your research process and your creativity process, your creative process. If you could all give me a couple of sentences on answer to that, that'd be wonderful.
So I like to engage with the ancient sources, really. So when I'm researching, then I want to be reading Homer and Euripides and Hesiod, because that's what I want to do a retelling of. I want it to kind of be my reinterpretation of the ancient story. So that really that's where I begin with research. And obviously with Hera, it turned out that was every text ever written, because obviously she appears in everything. So that was a much longer, much more difficult process than my other novels. And then the creativity process is really like, it's not very much more complicated than once I have all of that, sitting down and writing it, which is the most difficult and simple thing to do. But there's not a magic way around it. It's just simply, you just have to show up every day and do it, I think. Do you want to take that, Claire and Susan?
Yeah, I'm very similar to Jenny in that I start first and foremost with the ancient literary sources. But another big factor in my research is archaeological research. My novels are grounded in historical realism, and I'm setting them in a real Bronze Age across the Mediterranean. So largely my stories become shaped by the actual environment that the characters are living in, and often that sort of gives me inspiration for the directions that it's going to take. So it's kind of a balance between literary research and archaeological research for me.
Because I am writing in 18th century, I do have a bit of a mix in terms of primary and secondary sources. I tend to actually go for the secondary sources first, so that's reading up on the era in which I'm writing in. For instance, the one I'm working on at the moment is going to be set in 1765 Prague. So I'm having to do a lot of research about Prague itself, but also Prague in the 18th century. And usually from all of that research, and I read a lot of non-fiction books for this, they tend to reference a primary source, and then I'll go off and find those. So the other day I found a 1765 almanac, which Google Books is wonderful when they kind of upload it for free, and you have to scroll through the whole PDF, but at least it's the original text. And so I find I wouldn't have found that if I hadn't have read a reference to it in one of the secondary sources. So in terms of my research, it's a combination of the two. And as Jenny said as well, in terms of the creatives, that unfortunately it's just a case of sitting down and writing it and trying to get those words on the page, and go from there, really. I'm afraid that's a very frustrating answer, but it is unfortunately the only one we can give you. Sit down and write and see where it goes. Rebecca, you're on.
You would think after, I don't know how many years of this, that I would get it now. Sorry. So what I was saying was, thank you all very much. That was really interesting. I have a question from Calypso, who she is asking a question that I wanted to ask too. Do you ever find that you have to compromise your own visions for your characters and stories in order to follow the original myths? Oh, look at your faces. That's a good question.
Well, there are so many versions of most myths that I would say that you can usually find the one that aligns most closely with your vision. And where you can't, I think, what is the point of doing a reinterpretation, a retelling, whatever you call it, if you are not going to shape it to your own vision? So I think that I have had to banish the mental image of kind of, really angry classicist reading over my shoulder and saying, this is wrong and this isn't how it happened, because there is no one way that it happened, first of all. And secondly, I think that the story has got to take precedence. You are writing a story, and so you need to make it be the story that you want to tell and that only you can tell. So I don't think it comes into conflict in a major way for me.
I largely agree with what you said, but also would say that sometimes there are those sticking points where there's a sort of a plot point of the myth that, I mean, if things were easy, you could just remove it. But to some extent, it's a creative challenge to take this character's arc that you're trying to work on, but then think, oh God, they're about to do this thing, which just seems insane, So how do we explain that in a believable way? And that's kind of a lot of how I get the path of my story. Like, how are we going to get from this point to that point in a way that isn't madness, essentially?
It fuels you rather than it being a conflict, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, for me, obviously, Pandora is the only Greek mythological woman I've written. But as I said earlier, for me, it was changing the perception of her from taking her curiosity as a sin and making it a strength. So when I was doing my initial research, aside from the kind of box vase sort of argument, which is a completely different conversation, I was definitely trying to flesh her out, because I didn't find there was an awful lot of information available about Pandora. It was mainly focused on Prometheus and Hephaestus, and obviously Zeus being angry with both of them. So it was really, just a case of me trying to look at her in a completely different way through and just give her agency through an 18th century lens. So obviously I made a lot of changes.
Am I allowed just a 30 seconds on this? You sure? I'm no novelist, but I have written recently. It's not coming out for a while, but it's in press with you. I was asked to write a biography of Medea, right? And I said when they first wrote to me, "How can I write a biography? She's a fictional character." But what I've actually done, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, is I've read a lot of criminal psychology, forensic psychology, about why women kill children. It's very disturbing, a lot of it. But I wasn't trying to tell her story sympathetically. I wanted to go into the heart of darkness. Why does somebody get so horrible, rather than trying to say she wasn't that horrible, if you see what I mean? So on top of it is a biography, I used only every single thing in it is backed up from an ancient source. But where I needed an explanation of an action, I found it in reports, psychiatric reports on, I'm afraid, women convicts, and that's my bit. I'm not writing fiction. I'm writing a biography.
It does make sense though, because I think one of the arguments we've probably kind of covered briefly in some form or another is that a lot of the Greek myths, they're very much revolving around human nature.
Yeah.
And also, to me, feminism has always been that we're allowed to be as bad as the guys.
Yeah.
I don't want the essentialist kind of, I went to Greenham Common. I'm much older than all of you put together. But there was a sort of essentialist thing about virtuous women that always made me snort. Some of the most evil people in world history have been women. Yes, in a different way. But so to me, true liberation is actually being allowed to have a really very, very unpleasant woman. Okay, her natural unpleasantness has been thoroughly exacerbated by patriarchy. I'm going to get that, but it's certainly there already. Deeply selfish person.
I definitely found that.
Sorry to lower the moral tone, ladies.
Shall I? There's another question for everyone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll shut up now.
No. My question is for everyone. I always wonder, how do you pick your main characters? Greek myths and drama are full of wronged women. Do you feel yourselves kind of obliged to be the voice of these women, or do you just pick a character you feel closest to you? I remember at school studying Homer and Euripides, etc., with male teachers, and having this feeling inside, somewhat rage, I might say, and continuously protesting, trying to be the advocate of these women, remembering that it seems tremendously difficult to pick a character.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of what that questioner has described as exactly the process I went through in picking Ariadne. It's in Ovid's Heroides, where she writes a letter to Theseus and she says, "Don't forget to tell everyone what I did." And it seems that Theseus did forget to tell everyone, so I decided that I would do it on her behalf, and that's why it's in the first person. It's giving her a voice. But what Edith was just saying about women having the right to just be awful and horrible and dislikable was really why I wanted to write Electra as my second novel, because Electra is one of the least sympathetic female protagonists in Greek mythology. I mean, not on the level of Medea, but she's still she's very hard to understand, I think, especially from a modern perspective. And it was really important for me to not go about redeeming her, but to make her understandable, but not sanitize her. And I've definitely feel the same with Hera. So it's just picking women who are interesting, I think. Which women in Greek mythology make me ask myself a question, kind of, but why did she do this? What does she want to do this for? What's the reason? And if I want to know the answer, then hopefully other people will want to know that too.
Yeah, I would say for my first two novels, it was a similar reason of finding women where I felt something had been missed out of their story, and that there was this huge injustice against them because they hadn't had a fair hearing, essentially. So I wanted to flesh out those women for that reason, but mostly they are victims, or at least they are victims of terrible things at some point in their story. Interestingly, the reason that I've chosen Dido for my third book is because I was kind of done with telling horrible stories about the horrible things that happen to women. There's obviously value in that, and it's something that needs to be talked about. But I think as a writer, you do reach a limit with suffering. So with Dido, I thought, well, here again is an interesting woman who maybe has gaps that I could fill on her story, but also she does actually have some power, which is quite unusual. You know, she is a ruler and she has far more agency than any of the other women that I've written about previously. So I kind of deliberately took a bit of a steer in a different direction when choosing that character.
I feel I've already answered this question, so probably best to go on to another one.
Okay, with that, there's a question from Karen Olson, who herself is a writer, and in fact, it's not really a question, more of a statement. And David Holton, who is the chair of the Committee for Society, Arts and Letters, who is kind of the umbrella organisation for this particular umbrella committee for this particular session. They've both brought up people like Margaret Atwood and other authors like Alicia Stallings, who also work in poetry and other forms of literature to discuss women in myth as well. And she's also, Karen's also mentioned Fiona Benson and her long poem Ariadne. Then there is another question about whether authors who have set their novels in ancient Greece, how do you balance the importance of historical accuracy, such as the politics, social hierarchies, and culture of the time, with creative storytelling? Is it acceptable to deviate from historical facts when crafting your narratives? But as I tell my students, there is no such thing as a fact anyway.
This feels like your arena.
Probably. Yeah, as I mentioned before, my novels are very much historical realist. I do a lot of research and try as far as possible to set them within a real Bronze Age setting. And I do take that quite seriously, in that I won't put anything in there that directly contravenes any evidence that I feel is worthwhile. As you said, there's not necessarily such a thing as fact, and especially when we're dealing with the Bronze Age, there's far more that we don't know than we do know. So there's a huge scope for creative license in terms of the detail. But I do take it as a serious responsibility to present a version of the ancient world which is accurate to the degree that I can make it accurate, particularly because I know that people reading these books will not have done all the research that I have done, or have the background that I have. So I don't want to mislead them about what ancient societies were like, or about what the experience of women in the ancient world might have been like. So I make that a priority.
And I think I do my best to make it, a not a jarring experience. So there's kind of nothing that feels really out of place in the Bronze Age. But I just think what I would have as a slight caveat when I'm writing is that if I want to include something from the Iliad, if I want to include something from Euripides, these are stories that are being told hundreds of years after they were set. So the kind of the world of the Iliad is Homer's version of the Bronze Age, or it's Homer's world, isn't it? Rather than necessarily the actual Bronze Age. And I think I really came up against it using the Euripides play Hippolytus, where Phaedra writes this incriminating letter. And would she really have been writing that letter? I don't think so, but I wanted to include it because it's a really important plot point. And I justified that on the basis that, well, if Euripides did it, I'm going to do it too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that these stories exist in their own space that is neither fully fictional or fully historical. So you can definitely tie yourself in knots trying to work out which thing you should be more faithful to. So it is just decisions that you have to make for yourself, and as you say, to make a good story, and also to try to be as faithful as you can. We're all human beings, and it's kind of an impossible task, but yeah.
It's your book, and you'll cry if you want to.
that's where I come out at the end.
I'll ask one more question and then perhaps I'll hand over back to Edith for a summing up, if that's okay. Would you say that there's a sense of mystery or otherness to these women that now, more than ever, we wish for it to be acknowledged? Classics often beautifully reflect and articulate human nature. Perhaps the phenomenon is rooted our deep human desire to be known, especially as women existing in the modern day.
So a kind of a sense of mystery and otherness to these women. I mean, there is, but there's that, because these are, I think that there is a sense of mystery and otherness to myth because it is so ancient and because it has been retold so many times, and it feels like something very special in that regard. But I think what draws me to these women largely is the humanity within them, and it's what really, I think, makes us keep retelling myths, that we find echoes of ourselves in stories that have been told for thousands and thousands of years. And I think that it provides us with this incredible kind of sense of connection throughout the time, throughout cultures, throughout history, and with what it means to actually be a human being. So I think there is that as well. Susan, Claire?
It is such a good question though, isn't it? I suppose the otherness comes from the fact that these are women of myth, you know, that in itself makes it feel very other. But at the end of the day, let's say these were real women. And that's the thing there, you know, yes, they're kind of translated into, if you know, in myth, but the issues and the stories that these women, you know, their backstories isn't altogether different from those who were necessarily real. Obviously, there's no way of knowing if, you know, a lot of, you know, if Pandora existed or, you know, Ariadne existed. You know, these are kind of stories that have come from somewhere. Are they inspired by real people? Have they, you know, they've just split it down through the ages. But as we've already kind of mentioned, the Greek myth, it very much is, you know, is a kind of expression of the human psyche and human emotion and the human experience. And so in that sense, these are actually very real. These are very real issues. So I think the otherness is literally just coming from the word myth. But the, you know, the women and the men and the children and all these, you know, terrible things that, you know, that have experienced. I'm sorry to kind of bring this up, but if you think of, you know, the wars, the Trojan War, you know, there's something in many ways very similar happening here. These are real people. And so that otherness suddenly just becomes, Absolutely. It doesn't come up, if you know what I mean. It's we can recognize patterns in history. Honestly, the word myth is what makes it other, but otherwise it's not. If that's a very garbled answer, but that's the kind of, that's the, you know, my thinking.
Not garbled at all, very clear. Edith, can I just, before you go into your rounding up, there's a question from a member of the team who would like to know, what can these retellings do for classics?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, depends what you mean by classics. If you mean institutionalized classics, the availability and brilliance of its institutional standing and amount of people that get access to it, I think it does an incredible amount. It's opened up whole new constituencies. We touched on this with the question about why now. The fact is, I think that some parts of the ancient world are being totally claimed by a constituency that has always been excluded, and that is state school kids, who are 93%. 93% of our secondary school kids are in state school. There is no chance of learning Greek. There's about 0.0001 chance of learning Latin. My campaign has been, just to put it up, Google on aceclassics.org. I have a campaign to get classical civilization and ancient history out into as many state schools as possible. This means that actually the consumer base for classics is changing rapidly, and this kind of writing feeds that. Young women, young working class and less privileged and state school women are finally getting to make it their own. I think it's absolutely magnificent. I support it to the hilt. I have a couple of closing remarks to make, but nothing does more. I see it on UCAS forms, right? I read Jenny Saint's blah, blah, blah. I read this, I read that. You know, I got excited by this novel. I think classics is for girls. You know, I didn't realise I could do classics without any Latin and Greek like those snobs like Boris Johnson. You know, I see it on the UCAS forms.
That's amazing.
I hope you're all glowing with pride, as you rightly should be.
It's true. All three of you have been named to me at some point.
Well done. Thank you all very much. I'd like to hand back to Edith now to sum up, if that's okay.
Well, this has been a wonderful event. The British School of Athens is one of my favourite institutions, and I'm more than ecstatic that it's extending its brief, having been somewhat associated with material culture historically, to all forms of aesthetic enjoyment of classics, and also it's been actually really important in gender terms. There's been a lot of amazing women who had opportunities at the British School in Athens, but this is particularly a delight to me. I think that tonight we found that there's actually feminist fire in the belly, and jolly good too. We absolutely need it. But people are also seeing that this is not just about gender, that there's been a general social exclusion. But you know what really comes over to me? Okay, and that is pleasure. Our the world is so dark. We have unremitting bad news, you know, on all the social media. People want to have some fun in their leisure hours, and they want delightfully to read, and actually book sales have gone up wonderfully since COVID. It's one of the few, you know, good things that have gone on. And I am absolutely the ancient literary critics, all of them said that the best literature is both useful, so it's somehow educational, and delightful. And if it's not both, why bother? And what I think all of these wonderful books that we've been talking about tonight are absolutely committed to the ancient literary critical. It's utile dulce in Latin, just showing off I know these languages, sorry. It's ophelimon hairdo in Greek. And that is the ancient litmus of great literature. And all three of you pass with flying colours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. Thanks to Edith for her wonderful sharing. Thanks to Susan, Claire, and Jennifer for your insights and for sharing your books with us and your inside scoops with us. Thank you all very, very much indeed. And thanks very much to the audience for your amazing questions. And I'm only sorry that we didn't have another few hours to stay with these lovely people. But thank you all very much, and hope to see you again at another BSA event. Thank you all.